Hey guys, and welcome to I think your first YouTube class of the semester. Thank you to the many of you actually who sent me something and worrying about my health. I am feeling probably better than I did when I saw you Tuesday, and much better than I felt yesterday when I thought I might have walking pneumonia. I went to the doctor. I don't have walking pneumonia. It's just a virus, and it's already starting to clear off. Anyway, that's more than enough about my health. Exam stuff. Along with the link to this YouTube, you should have seen attached the study guide that I promised you for this exam. We'll go over it obviously on Tuesday. I'll go over all exam questions with you. If you have a question that you feel like can't wait until Tuesday, please just email me, call me, text me, whatever, the whole spiel. And we can get that resolved. Remember, the test is the test starts next Wednesday at 5 p.m. You have until 11:59 p.m. to do it. You have 75 minutes. It will be administered by Blackboard and all the stuff that I did manage to tell you on Tuesday. And again, we'll review the logistics this coming Tuesday for the exam that happens 6 days from today, basically. Okay. By way of review, when I saw you last, we were talking about the quasi-experimental model of doing research, which is what Mannheim and Rich described for you in the readings that happened that day. The quasi-experimental approach comes from the idea that we know that we can't do experiments on everything that we care about in social science research because of ethical concerns, because of Hawthorne effect type of concerns, because, representativeness of the results outside of the lab, those types of things. And yet, there's something about experiments, specifically the notion that by establishing strong controls, right? By controlling for all the different factors that may affect the results, except for the one thing that is our treatment, we can make strong causal claims. That's really appealing to me, hopefully to you, and to most social science researchers. So the idea behind the quasi-experimental way of doing things is that we're going to mimic experimental controls, experimental sampling, all these other things, as much as we can in social science research projects that take place outside of a laboratory setting. All right, so the quasi-experimental approach is just that we mimic, as far as is possible and is practical and is desirable, the experimental methodology outside the laboratory. All right. Mannheim and Rich introduce 5 steps of the quasi-experimental method that I think are pretty good. Step 1, formulate a theory. Step 2, we operationalize that theory. Step 3, we choose how we're going to do research. Step 4, we do the research, we collect the data. And step 5, we analyze results. Remember that I add a 6th step there, which is that you need to communicate the results, and that we will talk a whole lot about steps 2 through 5 as the semester progresses. But we talk mostly on Tuesday about hypothesizing, about hypotheses. All right, a hypothesis is just a statement that you want to test the truth of in your quasi-experimental, or frankly, for that matter, experimental study. So hypothesis is just a proposition that you want to test if it's true or not through research. The importance of a hypothesis, we talked about 3 reasons why hypotheses are so important in quasi-experimental research, all right? Reason number 1, if we go in and we try to examine stuff without a hypothesis, we're likely to be overwhelmed. The world is a very big place, and the thinking between quasi-experimentation, or the thinking on quasi-experimentation, is that we need to limit what we're going to study so that we don't get overwhelmed by spurious information, by all these different things that pop into our head when we just walk into a situation blind. All right, so that's number 1. Number 2, and probably the most important reason. Well, no. Number two and number three are probably the most important reasons. Number two, we think that by the use of a tightly structured hypothesis and a tightly structured study that comes after that, we are able to minimize as far as possible bias in quasi-experimental settings. What do I mean by that? Remember Lakoff, and remember the idea that information sticks to our brains if it agrees with what our narratives are already in place, okay? If we go out into the world without a lot of structure to do our research, we are going to inevitably remember things that conform to our narratives. And that stuff's going to capture our attention whether we want it to or not. And we're going to ignore the stuff that goes against our narratives. Quasi-experimentation and experimentation tries to limit that by tightly structuring everything, all right? So we have a tightly structured hypothesis, and then we measure the truth of that hypothesis in terms of real tangible things, all right? So we will say, if I see any water in this glass, that means that I have something to drink. All right? We can clearly measure the key concept here, right? Which is water. And glass, I guess, is a key concept here. But that we really have to define those things. There's no doubt, right, about whether or not there's water in this glass. Everybody would agree that there's water in this glass. Social science seeks to tightly structure its examinations through tightly structured hypotheses and studies, so that all questions that we ask, the answer is going to be as obvious as, is there water in this glass? All right? Because by doing so, look, let's say that I'm really anti-water. All right? Let's pretend for a second that I really hate water. I think water's awful, da-da-da-da. And yet even I, as a water hater, can't ignore the evidence that there's water in this glass, right? Now I'm thirsty. And so in social science, we want our examination to yield clear, measurable results that everybody can look at and agree on, because we think that it allows us to be more rational, to come up with evidence that we can all agree on, and to avoid sort of like Lakoffian type of bias, right? The third reason that we do hypotheses is because we need to establish a theoretical link, all right? There's no reason to expect that if I fill this glass up, that Bernie Sanders is going to win Nevada, or Marco Rubio is going to surprise and win the South Carolina primary this weekend, right? For a theory to for an examination in social science to mean something, it has to yield a result that we can reason through, that we can think through, that makes sense to us, that plausibly relates to phenomena, right? Because we're not interested in studying coincidences. We're interested in studying real information, or studying real things, real relationships that can help us predict the future. And unless we can put a theoretical link on that, then what's the point? All right? Now, so the importance of hypotheses, right? That's the three things there. How do we do good hypotheses? The biggest way that we do a good hypothesis is that we do our background research before we start the study. So remember those 5 steps that we had to the quasi-experimental model, all right? I added a 6th one, which is communicate, all right? I'm also adding a 0 step, and the 0 step is that you need to do background research, all right? We don't want to study something that has already been studied before. And we want to go into our examination with some understanding of the phenomenon that we care about, so we can ask good questions, right? It would be really stupid for me to try to develop a hypothesis about let's say, who's going to win the U.S. presidential election in November, unless I understood something about the presidency, unless I understood something about the candidates running, about what makes voters decide, those types of things, right? So we do some background research so that we can form intelligent hypotheses, right? So that we can form good hypotheses that will inform social science. The last thing that we tried to talk about on Tuesday was the relationship between the hypothesis and the null hypothesis. And that goes to the nature of what happens when our study doesn't find the relationship that we care about, right? If I have a hypothesis that this iPod cover is red, all right, and I do a social science examination, at the end of it, my study is not necessarily going to prove that it's black, all right? It's not even necessarily going to prove that the iPod is not red, all right? It's only going to prove the null hypothesis. And the null hypothesis is just that this study did not find evidence of the hypothesis. So in this case, I'm going to do my study, if I'm doing it in a strictly quasi-experimental way, as structured as possible, at the end of it, I'm going to have to reject the hypothesis that this iPod cover is red, and I'm going to have to accept the null hypothesis, which is that my study found no evidence that this iPod cover is red. And I keep saying iPod. That's because I'm old, right? So the null hypothesis is important because it's important to remember what happens when we don't find evidence to support our hypothesis. All it means is that we didn't find support for the hypothesis. Is that it does not necessarily mean that the opposite of the hypothesis is true. Okay? That was the review from Tuesday. With that in mind, let's change things up quite a bit, actually. And we'll talk about the reading that you had from Tuesday, which was Fenno. All right? So in Fenno, right, it's probably immediately clear that we are dealing with something very different from the quasi-experimental method. And you can kind of tell that just from the ways that he tried to gives his process a name, right? He talks about it in terms of like, oh, I call this soaking and poking, or I call this participant observation. But really, right, I think the best name that he gives it is just hanging around, because that's kind of sort of what he does. All right. So Richard Fenno, in the appendix that you read, is describing his research on Congress. This book came out in the 1970s, and prior to this book coming out, we didn't know a whole lot about how Congress people interacted with their constituents. A constituent is someone that the congressperson represents, right? So you, me, everybody else will go to the voting booth in November, and we elect a congressman, all right? At that point, we become that congressman's constituents. We expect that congressman to do stuff for us. We expect him to like look out for our interest in Washington and that type of stuff, all right? Well, in the 1970s, we knew a fair amount about Congress. But what we didn't know was how a congressman, and yes, unfortunately at this point we are dealing with congressman, far more than congresswoman, but we didn't know that much about how a congressman interacted with the people that he represented once he went back to the district. So when he's not in Washington, right, he's supposed to be, the congressman is supposed to be back at home, and he's supposed to be like chatting it up. He's supposed to be going up to like, Tyler, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Am I doing a good job for your interest? What are your concerns? What can I do for you in Washington, right? Brian, what can I do for you in Washington, right? That type of stuff, we knew very little about how Congress people actually interacted. And so that's what Fenno wants to study. The way that he proposes to study, the way that he did study this, right, was that he went with Congress people out into their districts during the campaign. All right. So when they were campaigning to get reelected, the Fenno would go out with the congressperson, and he would just sort of be around the congressperson and their reelection campaign and observe them. All right. Once he got to the congressperson's district, he followed them around and he treated everything as potential data. So what does that mean? It means if the congressperson gives a speech, that can be potential data, right? It means that if a congressperson has a phone call with influential constituents, that can be something. It can mean if the congressman has an interesting conversation, or I'm sorry, if Fenno has an interesting conversation with the congressman's wife, or the campaign staffer, or a guy that he just meets off the street, like me, right, who says something about the congressperson that he finds interesting. Anything that Fenno thinks is interesting and germane, that is, anything that Fenno thinks is relevant to his study, he treats as potential data. All right? It's an extremely informal method of doing research, right? He has some things that he wants to look at. He has some questions. He has some hypotheses. But they're really general, right? And they're not that developed. And he does some background research. He knows a lot about the district that he's going into. He knows how the congressperson acts when they're in Washington. But like, he doesn't let any of that keep him from changing things up if he sees something more interesting, right? So if the congressman says something interesting and Fenno was like, oh, well, my hypothesis going in was that the congressman would interact based on, say, how rich people were. But then the congressman tells me that, no, what really matters to me is that I interact with females more than males, right? Fenno will say, oh, all right, shoot. Then I guess I'm going to watch him for this. And I'm going to ignore my previous hypothesis and just focus on like this new hypothesis that just popped into my head when I was out there doing all this observing. Okay. Think about for a second how this research style that Fenno describes, this home style, would sound to Lakoff. How it would sound to Manheim and Rich, right? So I just, in this review, started to talk about, hey, like, Lakoff says that information that conforms with what we want to think is going to stick to our heads. Manheim and Rich try to impose some structure. Quasi-experimental tries to impose some structure to avoid that sort of like bias trap that Lakoff says we're hardwired to do. Fenno's just out there like making decisions as he goes along. There's no structure that's happening. So the potential for bias in what Fenno's doing, in those little Lakoff demons that operate 98% of our head, right? It kind of seems off the charts here. It seems like there's a lot of ways in which bias comes in. All right. Let's talk, and Fenno acknowledges that, right? Fenno talks about like, look, the reason that we study Fenno, the reason we study a book in 1970 written on Congress is not because of what he said about Congress. Like, he said some really good and important things about Congress, but the study of Congress and the study of how congressmen relate to their constituents has come a long way since 1970. All right. The reason that we still read Fenno and study Fenno is because of his description of his methodology. And one of the reasons that we like this description is that Fenno, I think, and most of the social science research community thinks, has done an excellent job of pointing out the flaws in his own research design. All right? In this case, the ways in which his loosely structured or unstructured way of doing things can introduce potential bias. Let's talk about some of the ways in which potential bias can come in, all right? Let's talk about the way that he captures data, or the way that he thinks about data that is or and is not relevant to his study, right? He's making those decisions about what's important, what's not important as he goes along, right? He's just sort of throwing himself into the process and waiting until something crops up and go, oh, that's important, right? He's not a tape recorder. He's not an iPhone with audio capabilities, right? I'm not that. You're not that, right? Humans naturally, selectively filter information. And what types of information get through our filters? That's the stuff that already agrees with us, or at least Lakoff and brain research would have us believe, right? Are we worried that Fenno is only going to remember the information that conforms to, say, what he wants a congressman to be, or what he thinks of the congressperson? On that note, right, he discusses in depth how worried he is that his opinions of people will influence the data that he gathers, right? He talks about, like, oh, I'm worried that if I start to like a guy, I'm going to remember only the good things about him. And if a guy blows me off, if a guy is kind of like a jerk to me personally, I'm only going to see and I'm only going to report the bad stuff about him, right? I mean, Lakoff would say that that's pretty natural, right? And not only, and that becomes really important with Fenno because Fenno is taking care to make people like him. And this is where he goes into this concept of rapport, right? The best way to think about rapport is that I have rapport with most of you guys, right? So, like, you and I are not hang out, be friends, like, we're going to go out Friday night. There's some, like, professional, there's a very big professional element of our relationship, right? And when you're professional, just the way that you are with me, what I am with you, you want to have rapport. You want to get along with people, right? And you want people to like you as much as is appropriate in that setting. So it's like, you know, all my terrible jokes about the Grammys and sports and stuff like that, that is my attempt to build rapport with you. I mean, I also talk about that stuff because I actually like it. But like, I'm building rapport, right? Because, like, I want you guys to feel good about me, so that will make you participate in the class, be interested in the class more, stuff like that, right? That's what Fenno tries to do, right? He tries to go out there and be friendly with people and sort of, like, to the point where it's like, if somebody says, hey, you want to go golfing with me? Ah, yeah, I'll go golfing with you. We'll golf. We'll just be boys. Well, I don't know. I don't golf, so, like, whatever people do when they golf, smoke cigars, right? If a congressman invites him over to grandmom's house for dinner, for a big family dinner, sure, go over there, hang out, yuck it up with the family a little bit and stuff like that. He'll even go so far as participating in campaign events for the congressperson. So Congressman says, hey, we need somebody to answer phone calls for us, or make phone calls on behalf of the congressperson, trying to convince undecided voters to vote for him. Think about that for a second. Fenno is trying to research a congressperson at the same time while he is making phone calls to try to convince people to vote for him. That sounds like a big potential for bias, right? It sounds like a huge bias worry. What Fenno faces here and what he discusses and what he's worried about is a problem that anthropologists would called going native, all right? So the idea from going native came out of anthropology, and it came because anthropologists noticed that when they went somewhere in the less developed world, right? I think this happened with sort of pre-industrial tribes in African parts of the Pacific. A researcher would go there trying to be unbiased. However, in the course of living among these people and seeing them, they would come to sympathize with these people. They would come to say, like, oh my gosh, these people are trying to keep away this way of life, and it's so hard to do it in the modern world with machines. And all these people want to do is, like, make sure that they live the same way that their ancestors lived 1,000 years ago. And they start to become so invested in the success of the tribe that they would lose enough objectivity to report on it. So going native is the idea that you get so into something that, like, you're no longer capable of being objective about it. Well, if Fenno is out there participating in campaign events and making phone calls and going over to grandma's house for dinner, right? How much danger is he in of going native? And that seems like a real thing, right? Fenno, a third type of bias that Fenno brings up is the notion of response bias. So response bias is the idea that people who choose to participate in your study and people who choose not to participate in your study are different in some way that matters to the study, and that therefore your study is not going to be representative. All right. Talking about the response bias problem with Fenno is probably helpful if we update it to contemporary world. All right. So in contemporary Congress, probably the biggest development in electoral politics in the last 6 years in the politics of electing Congress is the rise of the Tea Party. All right. For those of you not familiar with American politics, the Tea Party is sort of ultra-conservative. They're the people who really think that George W. Bush was insufficiently conservative, and that all the Republican leaders in Washington are kind of like sellouts and not conservative enough. And they're very right-wing. They're very conservative, all right? Let's say I was going to do Fenno's story, and I want to study Congress. Well, I really want to get some Tea Party people involved because I think, look, the Tea Party is their own movement. They might be different in some way from all other Congress people, and so I need to study them, right? Because they're a big part of what's going on in Congress. Because, however, conservatives in the United States generally tend to distrust academics like me, all right? They might say, no, Shelley, liberal elite in your ivory tower, right? We're not going to participate in your study because you're just going to make us look bad. Screw you. Yeah, that's a huge problem if they will not participate in my study because the way that they're not going to participate and I'm going to miss a big part of the study. That's the response bias problem that Fenno brings up. Okay? So we've got all these, and that's just a highlight, right? He has a big discussion of all the ways in which, he talks about a number of different biases, all right, that could come up. So why are we reading about this guy, right? Like, why don't we just say, this guy's a nut? Well, we're not going to take anything that he says seriously, all right? Why did Fenno is a trained social science researcher. He took a course much like the one that you're taking now, took a bunch more of them on like how to do good research. So why the hell is he trying to do this way? All right. And that brings us to why we read Fenno in 2016. All right. Fenno talks about, look, even though I know all the rules of good research, and even though I know that I'm quote unquote breaking a lot of rules of good research here, I still did it this way, right? And he presents the argument for why he did it in such an articulate fashion that it has convinced most people, and certainly convinced me, right, that his type of research, which in some ways is the opposite of the tightly structured, quasi-experimental Mannheim and Rich style research, that his type of research has value and has real value and has real scientific value. All right, so let's get into a discussion of this. All right. The first thing that we need to acknowledge is Fenno wants to establish rapport, right? And it's not just because he wants to be well liked. It's not just because, oh, like, you know, everybody, I want everybody to like me, I'm running for homecoming queen. No. Fenno thinks that by being nice to people and by being professional with them and interacting with them, they might start to relax and let their guard down. And therefore, they're going to be more likely to just act like they normally would. All right? And so that Fenno, by establishing rapport, he's going to, because think about it, right? Again, think about the example of me hanging out with you guys on Friday night, right? Huge Hawthorne effect stuff there. Huge, like, we're not going to act the same as long as Professor Shelley's here. Well, that's what every congressperson and their staff is going to be like when Fenno first gets there. And Fenno has figured out, look, if I hang out with these people a little bit, if I show them I'm actually just a normal person, they're going to relax and I'm going to be able to get more information out of them than I could on, say, a survey or in an experiment. All right? People letting their guard down, they're going to just, rather than look at you as a researcher, they're going to look at you as somebody to talk to and as who's interested in what they're doing. And as a consequence, they're going to say stuff and tell them stuff about you, about the way that, tell them stuff about themselves, about the way that they look at their constituents, that you wouldn't get that information any other way. It's only by making yourself a part of the process that you can get this great in-depth information. All right? The second reason that Fenno chose to do it this way is because he, what he wanted to study, it's hard to imagine how we'd capture that any other way. So what Fenno wants to capture here is a process, right? He wants to capture the process of the interaction between constituents and congressmen and congresspeople now that we're in 2016, right? Well, you can't put people's interactions into a library, right? Or into a laboratory, right? So if we took our class and all of a sudden some experimenters came in, they said, all right, we're going to conduct an experiment. You're going to do it in the lab. Shelley, teach the way you normally do. Students act the way you normally do. None of us would act the same, right? The Hawthorne effect would be off the charts. And that would be particularly damaging to the study because what the researchers would care about would be the process of our class, the way in which you and I interact when we're in our natural state, right? Likewise, we can send out classroom evaluations to you guys to like rate me at the end of the semester, right? But like you're going to answer those questions, but there's going to be but you know, Fenno might say, how much do those evaluations actually capture about what it was like to be a student in Shelley's class, right? How much can we actually understand about Shelley's class just from like, you know, 20 multiple choice questions or whatever they give you, right? In other words, if Fenno wants to observe something the way that it actually happens in its natural state, he has to go out and participate, right? He can't put it in a lab, he can't conduct a survey, he can't do anything else because the Hawthorne effect stuff will be off the charts. The only way to get the information on the process is to go there, right? We should also recognize, right, that just because Fenno has to conduct a less structured observation doesn't mean that it is unstructured. He imposes structure to reduce bias where he can, right? So he has some rules on his report. He says when he says that when he sees that he's actually starting to think of someone as a friend, he's like, okay, I got to cut off rapport here because I'm losing objectivity on this person. All right. He also says that he likes bad interviews. And he likes it when the congressman is rude to him, doesn't like him, doesn't give him access and stuff like that. And that seems weird until you read his justification, which is that, hey, you know, if people have a bad interaction with me, like if they don't like me, if they don't give me a lot of access, he says, oh, is there something about the way that this person doesn't like me that represents the way that they interact, right? So in some ways, right, he's correcting for the response bias problem here because he says, like, look, I love it when people don't like me, right? That sounds a weird thing to say, right? But he's here like, look, if one of the things that we're worried about is that people who don't like the study aren't participating, he says, I'd like it when I figure out that people don't like that they're participating, because that means I've done a good job of making sure I've got all types of Congress people and that my response bias problem won't be that bad. All right. He also worries a lot about his sample, right? So when he he's constantly updating his list of which congressmen he's going to study. And so he'll often look back at that list and say, like, oh, I got a lot of Democrats here. I need to go out and get some Republicans. Or, oh, I have a lot of people who have been in Congress for 20 years already. I need to go get some people who've only been in Congress for a year or two. All right. In other words, he is imposing structure on his sample because he wants that sample to be as representative as possible. Okay. He's still trying to be as structured as he possibly can and to introduce structure where he can, but not at the expense of getting the information that he cares about. All right. And that raises, like, what I think is the key defense and maybe the only defense of Fenno that we need. Having read Lakoff and having read Mannheim and Rich and experiments and stuff like that, we get really obsessed with bias and limiting bias because of the way that the human brain works. All right. Fenno wants to come in and say, yes, I understand that reducing bias is critically important, but reducing bias is not why we do research. We do research to get information. And Fenno's argument here is there are some situations in which quasi-experimentation won't work, that we have to relax the structure and still allow ourselves to be part of it, even though we know all the stuff about bias, right? And the reason that we relax the structure is because there are some times when only less structure gives us the information that we need to know, right? The main defense of why Fenno did what he did was because the situation did not allow him to be more structured and still learn about what he cared to learn about. All right? And that, I think, is really important for social science research and for you guys to understand, right? There are going to be some situations that we want to know about and that we have to know about where we can't be as structured as we would like, or as quasi-experimentation would like to. And that doesn't mean that we just give up, right? It means that we wade into the situation, even though we know bias may be going on, right? And we try to get the information we need. And the only way that we can do that is to keep asking ourselves questions about, are we biased or not? You know, Fenno is constantly asking himself, okay, where's my bias at, right? Where's my bias at? Is my bias influencing the study? And if it is, how much can I correct for that, right? Same thing with me. I'll talk throughout the semester about different situations in which I've done this research. But, like, I always ask myself when I'm doing something like Fenno, like, where's my bias at? And when I'm doing any research, I'm here like, am I biased here? Like, you know, am I like da-da-da? And ultimately, I think that we have to do less structured research because there are problems that we can't structure, but that we need to get information on. And ultimately, whether or not you accept this less structured research depends on the steps that the researcher takes to introduce as much structure and to reduce bias as possible. Okay? And that's going to be an individual distinction. Maybe a lot of you are hearing this and just saying, like, man, like, this just sounds way too biased for me with Fenno. And to an extent, you're right. And we will talk about on Tuesday what are the limits of Fenno's ways of doing things, and like what does that mean for the way that we treat information from a Fenno story? But from right now, I just want you to understand that, right, structure and reducing bias isn't everything. Getting the information and doing so in an ethical way is the goal of social science. And sometimes to do that, we have to reduce the structure, even if it introduces bias concerns. With that, I will let you go and I will start to upload this. And I will, unless I'm dead, I will be in class on Tuesday because I'm going to be there for exam questions. So see you then. Bye.